Okay, hello, good morning, everyone. This will be the second to the last topic on computer radiography and digital or direct radiography subject. Okay, it's entitled Image Acquisition Errors. So, of course, we'll be discussing what are the errors during image acquisition on both CR and DR and how will they affect the histogram and the quality of the image. Okay, so we'll also be discussing the effects of scatter radiation on the quality of the film and how uh, and the low radiation response of your PSP plate. So let's start. Yeah. Only data from within the anatomy must be included during the processing. Other variables which can throw off the histogram analysis include positioning and collimation errors, unusual pathological conditions, removed or added anatomy, and artifacts such as prostheses that are present during the initial exposure. Okay? So dapat mong di ba, when we image no an anatomy, for example, the hand, dapat i-collimate din natin siya taman. Okay? Dapat i-collimate natin siya ng mabuti because an increase in field size will not only throw off the histogram analysis, no, but it can also increase scatter radiation, therefore reducing the quality or the contrast no, of the image. Okay, so it is very much important that it is not only applied in film screen systems but also in digital systems such as a CR and DR. No? Dapat collimated ng mabuti ang inyong anatomy when you are imaging, no matter what part it is and no matter how thick it is. Okay? If pitch black background densities or the tail of histogram are included in the computer's calculations, the final image produced will be skewed away from the desired brightness and contrast levels. Okay? So again, dapat yun na, pero if ever man na naa siya ma-appeal na na some like prosthesis, artifacts, no? Increase in field size, no? Decrease in collimation, the computer will include this in calculations na dapat hindi sila kasali because no for example sila prostheses, okay, they are and the shields or the contrast media which is seen in the first part no in the left side of the histogram or the S1, dapat hindi sila kasali, and also si S2 end part sa S2 or the tail of the histogram, dapat hindi sila kasaling dalawa because this will alter no the quality of the image and it will throw off the calculations of the computer. Okay? So for example, imagine nyo na lang na mag-picture kayo katabi ng isang flashlight. Okay? So pag acquire nyo ng image niyan, pangit talaga because there is light, no? There is increased light exposure. So pag i-edit niyo yun siya through filters or so ba? Pag-decrease ng brightness, it cannot be salvaged because bright man good ang production sa light sa flashlight. So, di na makita ang face nyo but ang ma-focus niyan is the light from the flashlight. Okay, parang ganun ang kanyang concept. So, to continue, we go with few histogram analysis errors. Okay, first one is the incorrect anatomic menu selection. So when the radiologic technologist mismatches the wrong anatomical preset in the computer with the anatomy position, the quality of the image may be compromised. It is therefore recommended to double check that the preset in the computer matches the anatomy being positioned. So ganito kasi yan. For both CR and DR, may mga presets yung computer. Okay, for example, you're going to image the, again, hand. Okay, so dapat ang preset na para bang filter ba na gamitin nyo sa computer is hand din na preset. Okay? Okay, kung abdomen yan tapos hand ang abdomen ang preset na gipili niya tapos hand ang inyong position or gi-x-ray, ang maglabas na image dyan is more on the contrast of the soft tissues rather than the bone. Okay? So dapat, again, it is therefore recommended to double check that the preset in the computer matches the anatomy being positioned because it can alter the image quality. Okay, now we go with exposure field recognition errors. Okay, there are two types, no? Collimation border recognition and multiple imaging multiple plates, which we'll discuss in a while. Okay, so on a DR system, off-centering of the anatomy can result in unacceptable image mottle. Okay, when the anatomy is not centered properly over the AEC detector cell so that it is exposed to the direct X-ray beam, the AEC shuts off early and underexposure results. Okay? So ganito kasi yan, for AEC or automatic exposure control, this is a device within the vertical grid that allows the patient to have lesser dose. Okay? So its function is to, when it feels na, okay, sufficient na exposure ni anatomy. So I'll cut off the exposure. Okay? So it is good for the patient. But when we are imaging, no, most especially sa DR na pareha itong image na hindi sila nakacenter on both A and B. So more on the left side siya. Itong si image A. Si image B is more on the right side. It is off-centered. So the AEC prematurely cuts off the exposure. Therefore, no, um, it shuts off early. It prematurely cuts off the exposure, therefore producing an underexposed radiograph such as this one. And for ADR system ang good, low exposure quickly results in the appearance of mottle. Okay? So dapat you should properly center the anatomy of interest so that the AEC will not shut off early or will not have premature cut off of the X-ray beam. Okay, so if you're going to zoom it properly, you can see that both of the images, when zoomed properly, is mottled. Okay, there is increased quantum mottle on both images. Okay, so how does this happen, Manggod? So, di ba exposure Manggod, pag mag-reach siya sa image receptor and it feels like na, and the AEC feels like na sufficient na siya na exposure, okay, so it will cut off na gid na siya. Okay? So dapat nakasentro gid na siya sa inyong image receptor. Okay? Ayan. For CR systems, they are more resilient to off-centering of the anatomy within the field. But occasionally, histogram errors can result. The radiograph on the side is a scapular Y, no, or Y view of the scapular in which there is an excess of the raw beam included within the collimated field and the anatomy is not centered. Okay? So, mas better si CR when it comes to collimation border recognition than DR. Okay? So, ang result lang ni CR is that there is underexposure. Okay? Although there is also underexposure on DR, it will, sa DR Manggod, not only underexposure, but also it can result to quantum mottle. Pero kanidire, the image, if it is not centered, no, it will only result to underexposure. So it can be edited post-processing. Okay, this resulted in a histogram analysis error and a dark image because again, more half of the image is background density man. Okay, so para ba no remember the example I told you about the flashlight, no? So if you're going to image half of the image with the background densities, of course, ma-throw off good ang histogram analysis and of course the quality of the image. Okay, so what will happen if the anatomy was properly centered? Of course, it will highlight properly the scapular Y, or the lateral projection of the scapula, and mas detailed siya compared to this image. Okay. Ayan. So this is the histogram of this image. Okay, so as you can see, there is excess background density. Dapat ang itsura ng S2 or the proper normal na histogram is within these dotted lines. Okay? But because there is excess background exposure, nagtaas ang tail ni histogram. Okay? Okay, now we go with the second type of exposure field recognition error, which is the multiple fields or plate. So in practice mong good, when multiple exposures are taken on one CR plate, for example, like this one, sa letter B, okay, it is proper practice mong good na para mas dali or mas easier for the lab tech to position the patient, and also para mas dali na lang po mas efficient ang processing or um, imaging of some of the anatomy. They expose one receptor plate or one PSP plate with two projections like this one. Okay, so one projection here and one projection here. Okay, it is often difficult for the computer to distinguish between the very light areas between exposure fields and similar light areas within the useful image. Again, it is often difficult for the computer to distinguish between the very light areas between exposure fields and similar light areas within the useful beam such as thick bones or barium. So in this case, maglisod si computer, no? Pag there are more than one projection, no? Sa isa ka imaging plate, it is difficult for the computer to assess this area here. Okay? Maglisod siya. Okay, so that is why the result is this sa letter C. Okay, so as you can see sa letter C, medyo na-throw off, hindi siya medyo na-throw off. Na-throw off yun ang calculations si computer because as you can see, there is a light strip here and the overall quality of both images are underexposed. Okay, the figure illustrates the field recognition errors that resulted when the computer reads both fields and the source and the space between them as one exposure. So ang pagbasa ni computer nito is as one exposure to siya, one projection to siya, all in all. Okay? 110 kVp was used to generate even more scatter. So, di ba? When there is an increase in kVp, there is also an increase in incidence of the scatter radiation. And this resulted in exposure recognition error evident at the upper margins of the fields where there is a light strip. So, masyag double dead. Okay? So, wala na gani nabasa ni computer ang area between the two projections. An increased KVP would result also to nag-scatter pa din siya. Okay? So, ganyan siya. So, dapat proper practice is to ano na lang, one projection each plate na lang, bahalag kapoy. Basta, at least, as you can see naman, better naman ang quality of image kaysa sa this one. Okay? Now, unexpected material in data set. A presence of a lead apron, a large prosthesis, or a large bolus of barium within the field of view can cause histogram analysis failure, resulting in a poor displayed image. Okay? Ayun siya. Since the presence of these materials manggod, ang labas niyan sa image is very white. Okay? So si lead apron, di ba kay absorb man yan? Absorb niya ang X-ray. Absorb niya ang X-ray because it's a metal. And also a large bolus of barium, which is the contrast media. Okay? These materials absorb X radiation, which will portray a very light, very bright, color white na image within these areas of the materials. Okay? So ang result niyan sa inyong, what do you call this? Histogram is, of course, since it's very bright and light ang kanilang ma-produce na image, the result of it in the histogram is mas taas siya sa S1 area because, di ba, from light to dark, ba siya from white to black. Okay? So sa left side portion ni histogram, mag-increase yan siya, which is dapat hindi siya because, again, ang normal lang na histogram is from this one to this one, resulting to proper image calculation. Okay? But with the presence of an increase in the S1 area and an increase in the tail of the histogram, of course, it will throw off the calculation. Therefore, producing a low quality image. Okay? The computer tries to identify the normal anatomical densities within the image as the bell-shaped portion of the curve extending from S1 to S2. So, gina-identify na yung asa man dire. Okay? Saan dito ang anatomy? Okay? So, the computer ends up identifying both the shield and the background density. Okay? So, this will result to this type of histogram. So if the light density area under the LED apron, prosthesis, or large bolus of contrast agent receives enough undercutting scatter to produce a signal, it can be included in the perceived breadth of the bell portion of the histogram, moving S1 to the left and widening the analyzed area. Okay, so as I have told you a while ago, pag sufficient ng exposure, no, mas kanang bright jud kaayo ang production sa image, it will be included sa analysis sa histogram. Okay, which will produce this area here, resulting to widening of the analyzed area of the histogram. Okay, and then of course, another type is a large overexposure error. Okay, so the histogram shows how the presence of scatter fog around a collimated field can be included in the histogram analysis. Again, widening the curve and throwing off calculations for the final displayed image. The same effect can occur on chest radiographs from including too much of the lighter abdomen within the field. So there are clues here. So asan niyo? Ayan, lighter abdomen. So that means when we say lighter, production of may include siya sa histogram on the part of the S1 because again, from white to black man siya. Okay? So when there is scatter density here, it throws off the calculation of the histogram na dapat dito lang man yan siya, but because of scatter density, na-widen ang range ng inyong histogram. Therefore, pag ma-include yung scatter density in the histogram, it will result to underexposure of the image. Although there is no underexposure din na nangyari, but because of the scatter density, no, parang underexposed ang inyong image. Okay? In all of these cases, inclusion of the lighter densities causes computer to rescale the displayed image to dark. Okay? So, yun nga, if there is an inclusion of lighter densities, it will produce an image that is too dark, overexposed pala, sorry, not underexposed. No, it will provide an image that is too dark, not too light, not underexposed, but overexposed po siya because there's overexposure error nga, di ba? Okay? And inappropriate rescaling, the last one. Rescaling errors can occur from dozens of causes and can result in a displayed image that is too dark, too bright, or with excessive grayscale or excessive contrast. Rescaling or histogram analysis, excuse me. Rescaling or histogram analysis errors are less common with DR systems because they include only the exposed pixels in the image database, whereas CR systems begin by scanning the entire plate and then trying to sort out exposed fields from unexposed portions of the plate. So ganito siya. Okay, on the side of DR, it can be minimized, no, ang rescaling errors. Okay, when we say rescaling, we are adjusting the brightness or the contrast of the image. Okay, so as I have said previously, di ba? When we rescale sa previous natin na topic, when we rescale, we adjust the contrast or the brightness or both. Okay, so when we rescale in the DR side, okay lang siya because it does not affect the quality of the image because ang gina-process ng computer is those that are exposed, no, ng mga pixels. Okay, but that is not the case for CR systems because as you can remember, ang pag-scan ni CR system is kinascan niya ang whole plate, so included yung mga unexposed and exposed na pixels, of which na dapat ang exposed lang na pixels ang kailangan ni computer. Okay, so if that happens, which all the time happens in CR, of course, there is decrease, no, of the brightness or increase in brightness or decrease in contrast or an increase in contrast. So there is inappropriate rescaling of the image. Okay? Yeah. So we go with the next one, which is the CR's low intensity radiation response. So due to the CR's increased sensitivity to radiation, so madali siyang makadetect ng radiation, no? So it has this disadvantage of storing background exposures. The imaging plate responds to an exposure of as low as 60 microrentgen. Okay? It has been known that background exposures are weak in nature. Since they have low energy, they can be easily sensed by the PSV plate due to the plate's low intensity response. So We all know that there is background radiation around us. And because of the PSP plates, no, sensitivity, increased sensitivity to background exposures, they can easily detect, no, background exposures po. So CR plates, manggod, are approximately 10 times more sensitive than the older film screen cassettes to accumulated background radiation during long periods of storage and to scatter radiation during exposure. So it does not only it is not only susceptible to background radiation, but it's also susceptible to scatter radiation during exposures. It only takes 100 micro Röntgen to produce a fog density on the plate. Okay? So, kinahanglan niya mag-reach ni PSP plate ng 100 micro Röntgen in order for noticeable density to occur or to be noticed, no, on the imaging plate. So, background exposure of the PSP plate can reach from 40 microröntgen to 80 microröntgen per day. Plates that are unused more than 48 hours should be erased. So, dapat yun proper na proper na practice is to, before mag-start of X-ray, you have to erase first yun, no? The contents of the imaging plate, no matter how long it has been in the storage. Okay? So for example, pagdating mo for your shift, no, duty, before you start na mag-x-ray sa mga pasyente, you have to erase yun. Okay? The contents before you start. Any plate that has not been used for several days will have accumulated sufficient background fog to affect processing and should be erased. Okay? So, of course, yung mga PSP plates na more than 2 days na, okay, it will really affect the quality of the image once it has been used and not been erased before its use. Okay? Any cassette left in the exposure area of a radiographic room should be erased prior to use. Nga, bago ko sabi ko lang kanina na before you start imaging patients, you have to erase it, okay, prior. Whenever the condition of a cassette is in question at all, it should be erased. So, if you are unsure of the contents of the cassette, kung ilang araw na ba siya wala nagamit or kung nagamit ba siya, it is proper practice to erase it before again exposing the cassette, okay, or the PSP plate po. Okay, here is an example of what happens if the cassette has been, for letter A, image A was processed from a CR plate that was erased and then stored behind the control booth during an abdomen exposure. So, before siya na-expose to scatter radiation because of the abdomen exposure, it has been erased, which is proper practice. Okay. However, because of its because of its high sensitivity to scatter radiation and background radiation, ayan, klaro gihapon ang inyong there is still scatter radiation. Okay, there is background densities in the middle and on the sides. Okay, di lang siya klaro because it has been erased man po. Okay, for the image B, okay, by comparison, fog density from natural background radiation can be made out on image B from a CR plate which had not been erased after 2 days of protected storage. Protected storage niyan ha. Okay, and it has been processed. So this will be the result of background radiation. Okay. So, as you can see, there is really high sensitivity of radiation sa CR plate. Okay. So, as you can compare niyo si A and B, mas arang-arang gyapon si mas better ang quality ni A because again it has been erased before the abdominal exposure. And itong si image C is from a plate set 2 meters away from an abdomen phantom that was exposed to 80 kVp and 30 MAS. Scatter exposure is readily apparent. Okay? So, we can therefore derive that mas dako or mas malaki ang effect ni scatter radiation kaysa kay background radiation. Okay? So, the image appears fogged. It appears darker than for background radiation only. Okay? So how do we control this scatter radiation? Yeah. Of course, we have to limit the beam. Okay, when we say beam limitation, we have to use the cones and cylinders, no, if possible. We have to use the aperture diaphragm or the collimator in order to reduce the size of the field, therefore rendering lesser scatter radiation. Okay? Large field sizes allow greater amounts of exposed tissue to generate scatter radiation. Okay? Since the concentration of the primary beam remains unaffected by the field size, the net contribution of scatter as a percentage of the total radiation reaching the image receptor is increased. So no matter the reason of increasing or decreasing the field size, basta mag-increase kayo ng field size, it will always result to increased scatter radiation. It is important to increase collimation or beam limitation to decrease the incidence of scatter radiation. Therefore, there is an inverse relationship between collimation and or beam limitation with field size and scatter radiation. So if ever you're going to increase collimation, field size will decrease and also scatter radiation will decrease and vice versa. Additional scatter is also produced from the tabletop or other objects anytime the light field is allowed to extend well beyond the anatomy. Of course, as long as the field size is adequate to include all anatomy of interest, there is no benefit to further increase in field size. So, wala talagang benefit no when you increase field size. It will only result to increased scatter radiation. Therefore, pangit yun ang, not necessarily pangit, but there is low production of low quality images. Okay, next, we have to provide optimal exposure, no, in order to control scatter radiation. And it is achieved by using the 15% rule. Using the 15% rule would allow all MAS values to be cut in half. Okay, so as you can remember, if you are introduced na with this concept or with this rule, when we increase KVP manggod with 15%, dapat in order to maintain the exposure, no? So this will cut the MAS to half. Okay, basta mag-increase talaga kayo ng KVP, bawas kayo ng MAS. Okay, which would restore patient exposures to previous level using rare earth screen technology. So this is employed, 15% rule is employed in order to decrease patient dose. Though increasing the KVP would result to increased fog, this can be edited, no? Edited through digital processing of the image. Okay? So dapat yun in all but chest exposures, dapat talaga high KV and low MAS lang po tayo. Okay? So that is the optimal exposure for all the body parts. So for the use of grids are recommended with CR imaging for chests larger than 26 centimeters and for all other anatomic parts greater than 13 centimeters in thickness, just as they are used in conventional radiography. Okay? So there are other books that cite that hindi 13 centimeter ang thickness, no? That necessitates the use of grid. It is 10 centimeters. Okay? However, dul-dul raman sila, 3 centimeters lang ang ligas or ang parang ligas, basta ligas. Okay? Yung 3 centimeters lang ang kanilang tawag niya. Oh, yun. Basta 3 centimeters lang kanilang difference. Ayun. Thank you po. So yun. So if we will only use grid when the thickness of the part, no, for chest is 26 centimeters or greater than 26 centimeters, and for the anatomical parts, which is greater than 13 or 10 centimeters. Okay, magamit na tayo ng grid niyan. Okay? On DR systems, all procedures, including small extremities, are done with a grid in place. So that means, when we use grid manggod, ayan, ito na nga. When a grid is used, technique factors must be increased over what they were for non-grid examinations. The MAS or the KVP must be increased. Okay? So pag magamit tayo ng grid, it is proper practice to increase the the radiographic technique, specifically the MAS and KVP. Okay? So kung ma-remember ninyo, as I have said to you a while ago, now on DR systems, all procedures including small extremities are done with a grid in place. So This will result to increased patient radiation on DR systems because all exposures, no, all procedures include the use of grid. Okay, but this can be compensated by the use again of the 15% KVP rule, in which it will increase the KVP, but then it will lessen the MAS into half. Through this, patient loss will then be decreased. Note that an extreme increase in KVP will necessitate the use of grid. So, since mag-increase man tayo ng KVP using the grid, no, never mind na yun. Basta, when we increase the KVP, no, extreme increase in KVP more than 90 KVP, we will, it will necessitate the use of grid. Okay, so the employment of the Potter-Bucky diaphragm or grid, no, not grid, basta Potter-Bucky diaphragm, which can be seen on the vertical grid, no, blurs out the grid lines from the final image, but there is still a loss of exposure called grid cutoff caused by the absorption of the remnant beam radiation. Okay, grid cutoff becomes much worse, taking large amounts of information out of the image. So what happens during grid cutoff pala? Ayan. Okay, so anytime improper distances are used or when the X-ray beam is not properly aligned with the grid, primary beam X-rays strike the lead grid strips broadside or at an oblique angle rather than passing through the grid parallel to these strips. Ganito kasi yan. When we use grid, dapat aligned ang divergence ng X-ray beam to the interspaces between the lead strips. Okay, this allows proper passing of the primary beam to the grid. Okay, therefore reducing the incidence of grid cutoff. Okay, grid cutoff happens when it is closer than expected ang inyong X-ray beam to the grid. So what happens is that pag produce ni X-ray tube ng X-rays here in the primary beam, ayan, hindi na siya maglagpas dito sa grid. Okay, therefore, there is cut off of the primary beam in these areas at an oblique angle. Okay, so as you can see, konti lang na parts of the remnant of the primary beam becomes the remnant beam. Okay, because of this, there is cut off by the grid of the sa inyong primary beam. Therefore, ginatawag siya na grid cut off, which will result to this image. Ayan. So, usually when there is grid cut off mong good, there is this production of these lines parallel to how the primary beam was cut off. Okay, so as you can see, there is cut off here and more exposure dito sa center because the grid was upside down. Okay, so much more density is produced in the center area of the image if the grid was upside down. Okay, nakabaliba, baligtad ang pagkalagay ng grid ni RedTech. So it is important to identify the front side and the back side of the grid, most especially those grid na hindi parallel. Okay? Okay, there are also other types of grid which is short dimension or SD grids. They have their grid lines running crosswise rather than lengthwise so that they may allow some vertical off-centering on the horizontal beam. Projections such as cross-stable hips and eggshell shoulders in which the patient is in the cubitus position, ayan siya, pwede siya ma-off-center because of the use of SD grid. Okay? If a short dimension grid is used such that the grid lines run parallel to the scan direction of the reader and the grid frequency is close to the Nyquist frequency, the more artifact will be created. Okay? Okay, so to give you an idea of what an SD grid looks like, ayan, ito po siya. Normally, the standard grid manggod is lengthwise, no? Pataas, pahaba ang kanyang pag-run ng lead strips. Okay? So, always remember that your grid is composed of both lead strips and interspace material. Okay? So, si lead strips, it is the one that absorbs radiation, and si interspace material, dun magdaan yung parts ng primary beam towards the image receptor. Okay? So it is also important to note that the grid is positioned in between the patient and the image receptor so that yung mga parts lang ng primary beam ang magpasok sa image receptor and not those scatter radiation because the main function of your grid is to control the scatter radiation, therefore increasing the quality of your image. So going back, si standard grid or the normal grid is pahaba ang kanyang lead strips and interspace material. Si decubitus grid is pa crosswise siya. Okay? Short ang kanyang lead strips. Okay? So yun nga. Okay. So what happens when we use short dimension grids or SD grids on CR? Okay? It will overlap with the Nyquist frequency of the reader manggod. Okay? So remember that your reader or the laser runs at this direction. Okay, so if your SD grid also runs in this direction, there is overlapping of the frequency of both the Nyquist frequency and the frequency of the lead strips in the grid. Okay, so if that thing happens, there is what we call the Moir artifact. I don't know how to pronounce it, pero I think it's Moir. Okay, the Moir artifact is a false presentation of diagonal lines caused when two grids of lines have similar frequencies are overlap. Okay, ganito siya. Moir artifact still happens in film screen systems. Okay, this happens in film screen systems where in two grids, there are types mga of grids that are overlapped with each other. Tapos pag that happens, when you use that overlap grid, it will produce the Moir artifact, okay, with the same frequency. Traditionally, this artifact could be caused by superimposing ayun nga, two linear grids. Okay? When two linear grids tapos same pagit sila ng frequency, Moir artifact will be produced. However, in the digital imaging, it is not called as Moir artifact anymore. Sa film screen lang yan siya na term. Okay? With CR imaging, the Moir artifact is actually much more likely to occur. This electronic version is called as an aliasing artifact. Okay? ALIASING artifact. Okay? So, Moir artifact siya when it is in the film screen system, but if it is digitized, when the image is digitized, it is called as aliasing artifact. Okay? Aliasing. Basta mo to siya. ALIASING. It is due to the Nyquist frequency, the frequency at which the CR reader scans the plate line by line, interacting with the grid strips which also have a frequency. Okay? So yun siya, as I have told you, sa film screen system, because of the superimposition of two linear grids which have the same frequency, more artifact will be produced. For CR imaging, when the Nyquist frequency overlaps with the frequency of the lead strips within the grid, ano ang tawag sa artifact? It's called aliasing artifact. Okay? So, as you can see, ayan siya. Ito ang artifact na mag-occur. Diba? As you can see, there are grid lines na ma-produce. Okay? So, difference between the standard and the decubitus grid or the LD or SD grid. Long dimension grid, short dimension grid. For example, for a 14 by 17 inch na cassette or na image receptor, long dimension grid has 17 inches long na lead strips. So that means these lead strips here are 17 inches long. Okay? Whereas a short dimension grid, which is this one, has 14 inches na lead strips. So these lead strips here are 14 inches long. A short dimension grid again may be useful for examination where it's difficult to correctly center the central ray for the long dimension grid. So for example po nito is for those patients na kailangan na i-decubitus position. Okay? So when we see decubitus position manggod, the patient is positioned either in a supine or nakahiga ang pasyente or nakatagilid. When that happens, the central ray there is horizontally pointed, no? Di ba niyo siya ma-imagine, but sige lang. It's the concept that counts, man. Okay? When the patient is in supine position or nakahiga siya or nakatagilid, the horizontal beam is pointed towards the patient horizontally. Okay? So, yun siya. Mahirap man kasi siya i-center pag naka horizontal ang beam, so we will be using decubitus grid in that case. But normally, ang standard grid yun or long dimension grid ang ginagamit natin for examinations other than the decubitus position na examination. Okay? I know it's a difficult time. Lisod yun siya i-explain. Nahirapan ako mag-explain. But hopefully you understood what I am trying to tell you. And if you have difficulties understanding, please message me so that I can accommodate you. I can assist you. I will try to make you understand and clarify the things that you have difficulty understanding. Okay, so that's it for this topic. I hope you understood most of it, kahit hindi man lahat, at least most of it. So yes, if you have questions, please message me sa Messenger, and we'll have a quiz about this on the next week. Next week, because wave man ang yung quiz this week. So for section A, wave man ang quiz nyo this week. So next week na siya. Okay? But for section B, next week. Next week siya. Okay? So goodbye and thank you so much.